Greetings, students. Mr. Little here, and today we're going to talk about economic continuities and changes within the Islamic empires. This is chapter 27, part 3. So by the end of this short video, you should be able to answer the following questions. How did economic practices in the Islamic empires represent both continuities and changes? And how did the Columbian exchange and the growing international trade market affect the Islamic empires? So let us quick talk a little bit about international trade within the empires themselves. So as you may remember from the map of these empires, most of them, even though they had sea access, were primarily land-based empires, which means they utilized the primarily land-based routes. And even though we tend to, along with the trans-Saharan trade route, we tend to discount the Silk Road after the voyages of Columbus, it's worth noting that the Silk Road was active up until the mid-1800s, and all three of the major Islamic empires utilized the Silk Road, as most of them straddled some part of the road, in particular Isfahan in the Safavid Empire, which is in part why Shah Abbas built his new capital of Isfahan in order to take advantage of the trade going through the Silk Road and passing through the Safavid Empire. This included the largest marketplace in the world, a 2-mile-long marketplace. And so this development, even though we usually think of Isfahan as this beautiful new capital, it was also a product of taking advantage of trade, as many rulers had done in centuries past. The Ottoman Empire also expanded their economic reach by building infrastructure such as caravansaries, which you might remember again from Unit 2, caravansaries being built on the Silk Road, caravansaries being built on the trans-Saharan trade route. So the Ottoman Empire had a network of caravansaries all throughout their empire. In addition to this, almost all major rulers of the Islamic empires would favor merchants and give them discounts, much as the Mongols had during their times. This is also one more reflection of that nomadic heritage at play here. When we talk about international trade, and we talk about the Ottoman Empire, for example, they primarily traded with the Italian city-states, the Venetians, and the Genoese, and the various seagoing Italian city-states, even after the discovery of a sea route to Asia, and even after the voyages of Columbus. You know, Venice continued to exist until the early 1800s as an independent city-state, and the Ottomans continued to be one of their largest trading partners. And Ottoman Egypt was still a major source of spices in Europe until the late 1600s, when the Dutch finally supplanted them with a direct source of spices from what's now Indonesia and Southeast Asia. So remember, even though we talk a lot about the Dutch East India Company, it took about 200 years for them to establish that monopoly and secure it. As I've mentioned before, tobacco became incredibly popular in all three empires. If you have to talk about the impact of the Columbian exchange on the Islamic empires, tobacco is definitely your go-to example. The Ottoman Empire also attempted to establish sort of a network of colonies, a network of contacts and communications within the Indian Ocean. This was sort of their efforts to create an overseas empire. A lot of times we talk about the Ottoman Empire and we talk about them as, you know, not building colonies in the Americas, which would have been logistically very challenging to do. But they did attempt to build colonies and make contacts within the Indian Ocean. And they used this as an opportunity. And they used, the sultans of the Ottoman Empire used their positions as caliphs to directly challenge the Portuguese in the Indian Ocean throughout the 1500s and into the 1600s, most notably at several key battles, including Diu, which is on the coast of what is now Gujarat in India. Of course, the Ottomans were not the only ones seeking international contacts. The Safavids were also seeking international contacts, and probably two of the most famous Englishmen of the time, famous because of their grandiose adventure going, were the Shirley brothers, who came from England to the Safavid realm in 1599 looking to make a business connection, and they promised to bring guns to the Safavid Shahs, who gladly accepted because they wanted to modernize the Kizobosh, and in some cases even create new gunpowder forces that would be able to lessen their reliance on the Kizobosh cavalry. And so even though the Islamic empires didn't, so to speak, go out and build colonies like Europe did, they nonetheless participated in the international trade system. Here's a map of the Ottoman Empire and its contacts and its trade system during this time period. It's a very, very cool map. So let us talk about the impact of all this international trade. Well, just like in China, just like in Spain, silver flowed into the Ottoman Empire. One of the reasons why was because even though Spain's ostensible reason for finding the New World or finding a direct sea route to Asia in the first place had been to go around the Ottoman Empire. Spain, oftentimes Spanish silver flowed into northern European banks, who then used it to buy things from the Ottoman Empire, like those spices I was talking about earlier. And unfortunately, the result was all of this inflation of silver devalued existing Ottoman silver. And just like in China, the Ottoman government was not able to pay their troops. And this was part of the larger crisis of the 17th century, that this inflation devalued the currency and made it very difficult for the government to maintain control, especially in the Anatolian heartland. All of this, I might add, was made much worse by the fact that it was the Little Ice Age, and it was probably the most intense part of the Little Ice Age. And so, while crops did not always fail, even when they succeeded, the yields were much smaller. So there was less food, same amount of work, but a lot less food. All of this sort of put together led to a series of rebellions over the course of the mid-15th to the mid-16th century, which struck out across Anatolia. That is the heart of the Ottoman Empire, led by former mercenaries and soldiers known as Zikbans. These rebels would take control of towns. They disrupt trade routes. They made life very difficult for the Ottoman Empire, especially when it had to move troops through the heart of its realm. This made it very tough for the empire to function properly. It would take a very long time to put down these revolts. And here's a map. Here's a picture of an Ottoman representative meeting with the Doge of Venice, offering trade goods. It's important to remember, or sorry, this is the Persian ambassador, my bad, not the Ottoman ambassador. You can see from their hats right there. It is important to remember that even though we tend to give a lot of focus to the Western European nations because they were doing all the voyages to the West, that the Italian city-states and other Eastern European nations were continuing to make contacts with the Islamic world during this time. And here's a painting of one of the Shirley brothers in Persia, kind of wearing Persian attire, making himself look very royal and regal. Something Europeans liked to do when they would go to new places. They like to dress up and go a little bit local, something we see a lot. Craft guilds, which we've talked a little bit about in Europe, back when we talked about Europe, were also something that existed in the Ottoman Empire. They regulated the production of and the quality of goods, but guilds were somewhat disrupted by the large inflation that came in with all of the silver, and they began to become less practically functional. Now, they would not go away until the 19th century, and part of the reason why Ottoman guilds held on so much longer than European guilds was because usually Ottoman guilds might be attached to a Janissary corps. Remember the Janissaries being like the Sultan's personal soldiers. These guilds might be attached to a Janissary corps, which means they have the support of the government to protect them, or they might be attached to a Sufi order, such as the Aki Brotherhoods throughout Anatolia or the heartland of the Ottoman Empire. And so in the Ottoman Empire, when we talk about in the future why things didn't industrialize the same way Europe did, part of the reason was that the guild system, which was weakened in Europe via the putting out system, didn't face such competition within the Ottoman Empire and stuck around a lot longer than they did in Europe, only being done away with in the 19th century officially. We also should talk about tax farming. How did the governments of these empires get their revenue? Well, for the most part, they simply taxed merchants and they taxed farmers. But sometimes, owing to the many wars that they would fight with one another or with outsiders, they needed a lot of money really quick. And so in this case, they would turn to a practice that we call tax farming, known as Iltizam. And basically, it's like a reverse loan. If you give a lord, a noble, a janissary, or somebody a region to administer for a certain number of years, and in those years they can do whatever they want to the land, tax it as much as they want in return for an upfront payment. Now, this can be very helpful in the short term if you need a lot of money really quick to wage a war, to wage a campaign, to wage a conflict. But in the long run, this can be devastating to a region, being stripped and overly taxed in order so that this noble or this janissary or the zamindar gets their investment back in the short run. And so this practice could be devastating in the long run when continually applied. And to a certain extent, especially within the Ottoman Empire, it became very, very commonplace. Sultans needing money to wage campaigns would regularly hand out these tax farming permits. Now, one of the most interesting things about the economies of the gunpowder empires, and in particular the Mughal Empire and its dependencies, in particular in Bengal, was that in this region, in India, what is now Bangladesh and India, it almost looks in a way like we're beginning to see the beginnings of an industrial revolution in the late 1600s and early 1700s. The increase in international trade, the demand for South Asian textiles, whether they're cotton or silk or some other cloth, really begins to pick up. And it's not just Europeans; it's West Africans. When I talked about the triangle trade, or talked about the bow tie trade in chapter 25, there's also Southeast Asians, rulers in in what is now like Vietnam and Indonesia. They wanted South Asian textiles too. It's not an exaggeration to say that at this time India clothed the world, because the textile production in Bengal was at probably the height. It's estimated that perhaps the region of Bengal, which is again located in modern-day Bangladesh and India, parts of India, may have been a third of the world's entire GDP, all this textile production that was going on there. And we see some of the features that we're later going to associate with industrial capitalism in Europe, such as the large-scale utilization of machines. They're called charkhas, and you may recognize these machines. Gandhi famously wove his own cloth, his own homespun, with these machines. And these machines would be used in huge numbers in kind of almost factory-like workshops in Bengal. And they would employ large numbers of weavers, and then they would export these products overseas. And they would get backing and financial wealth from local families who would invest and get a return. And this is, again, sort of how the European Industrial Revolution started off, except that you had water-powered looms creating textiles, and then this would spread to other items that would later, such as steel and mining coal. And so we begin to see in South Asia what looks like it might be an industrial revolution. And if you wonder, well, why didn't it happen there? It was a combination of a number of things. Bengal is susceptible to really devastating famines every 5 to 10 years. Because the monsoons do fail at least once a decade, or at least they used to. The monsoons are much less predictable now as a result of international climate change. In addition to the fact that you might realize that at this time, mid-1700s, the British and the Europeans are already starting to kind of very aggressively not just trade, but flex their power over this region. And we're going to talk more about that later on. But a number of factors sort of combined to prevent of what we might call a full-blown industrial revolution from happening in what is now Bengal and parts of Bangladesh and parts of India. But it's very interesting to keep in mind when discussing the economies of like the Mughal Empire, for example. And also important to keep in mind that even though there's guilds and there's traders and there's crafts, the vast majority of the people in all these empires, and would be until the end of these empires, were farmers. This is largely true of every empire in the world at the time, but most of the people that worked the land were farmers. Most people were not merchants. Whether you owned a lot of land or a little land, you were still a farmer for the most part. Although Istanbul was huge, it required the support of almost all of the empire's farmers to support large cities like Istanbul, as well as other big cities like Cairo or Damascus. And so a lot of these empires, they focused on acquiring resources to assist in their population growth. So we're still looking at a mindset of empire where you need to go out and conquer territory to get more food to feed your people. So, for example, the Ottoman conquest of Egypt resulted in a huge increase for the Ottoman Empire of grain production, because Egypt is incredibly rich in grain. So it's important to keep in mind that agriculture still influenced a lot of the policy thinking of these empires, in spite of any developments or changes that might have taken place. Well, I want to thank you for joining me for this bite of history. I've hoped you have learned something, and my name is Mr. Little, and I will see you next time.